All right, well, thank you very much. We're going to start with our second panel on modernizing voter registration. Again, I'm Wendy Weiser from the Brennan Center for Justice, and I am joined by a distinguished panel of both county election officials and private groups that are innovating in the voter registration arena. Any serious effort to improve our voting system and to reduce long lines at the polls has to address voter registration. Currently, the voter registration system is the biggest barrier to free, fair, and accessible elections in America. It is an outdated and paper-based system in most states. It is full of errors, and it creates needless barriers to voting, opportunities for abuse, and long lines on Election Day. The scale of the problem is enormous. More than 50 million Americans, 1 in 4 eligible voters, are not registered to vote. While some do choose not to register, far too many try to register and fail or are dropped from the rolls. Harvard-MIT study found that in 2008, up to 3 million citizens who thought they were registered showed up at the polls only to find that their votes wouldn't count because of registration problems. And an earlier study, a Harvard study, found that 1/3 of unregistered citizens had previously been registered and then fell off the rolls because they moved and did not re-register. Our voter rolls are not only incomplete, they are also inaccurate in many ways. A study by the Pew Center on the States found that 1 in 8 registration records is invalid or has serious errors. And this hurts voters and creates opportunities for fraud and abuse and makes it harder to administer elections. And these problems beget other problems. When a voter's name can't be found on the rolls, she can't vote a ballot that will count. And when poll workers have to spend their time searching through poll books for names that have been improperly deleted, left off, or misspelled, and when they have to help affected voters fill out provisional ballots, we end up with longer lines. This is an eminently fixable problem. When a citizen takes responsibility to vote, the government has a responsibility to make sure that the system will work, that she will be registered, and that her vote will be able to count without enduring an ordeal. And there are some real common sense fixes that we're seeing in states across the country that could help improve our voter registration system. And I'll just briefly mention a couple of them. A fully modern voter registration system would make use of existing modern technology to make the system much more accurate and complete. We would have a mandate for automating the registration process at all the state agencies that offer voter registration services, and that would make the process paperless and seamless for both voters and election day and election officials. We would have voter registration be portable using technology so that voters' information would be updated and the voter rolls would be much more accurate when voters move. It would have fail-safe procedures to ensure that eligible voters whose information is not on the rolls or is not up to date, they can correct that information either online or at the polls when they vote. And we would have also, and that would include things like same-day registration and online voter registration. And we would also have updated management tools like electronic poll books. We're going to hear about, in addition, we would have innovative private tools that would also help voters to, election officials to maintain more accurate rolls and voters to more successfully access voter registration. There is a huge momentum in states across the country right now to modernize the voter registration system. There are at least 25 states currently that have introduced bills that would modernize the voter registration in one of these ways, or in many more than one of these ways. We've already seen a number of bills pass this session. Colorado recently passed a broad-based bill that would modernize the state's voter registration system in several ways, including election day registration, making registration more portable, and including pre-registration for eligible 16 and 17-year-olds. Maryland expanded same-day registration during the early voting period. North Carolina passed a bill that would automate the voter registration at the motor vehicle offices, and Virginia and West Virginia have already passed online registration. We see bills still pending and active in many states to accomplish these kinds of reforms. So we are delighted to hear about some of these innovative new techniques that states are using to improve their voter registration system. We will start with Michael Dickerson again from North Carolina. North Carolina is ahead of the curve in terms of modernizing its voter registration system. Since 2007, North Carolina has had same-day voter registration. As such, it's one of 9 states, plus the District of Columbia, that allow an eligible voter to register to vote and cast a ballot before election date, after the close of after the close of the regular registration period, either before or on election day. The same-day registration states have historically led the nation in voter turnout, and that has been the case in North Carolina as well. North Carolina's system is also innovative because it uses electronic poll books tied to the statewide voter registration system. And in addition, since 2006, North Carolina has partially automated the voter registration process at the state motor vehicle offices, so that the agency electronically transmits voter registration data to election officials, and data is typed in only once. Now, many of these reforms are now under attack in the current legislative session, but we're going to hear some of the best practices now from North Carolina. Thank you, Michael.
Wendy. As Wendy mentioned, in 2007, our General Assembly passed the voter registration law that permits voters to walk in during early voting if they hadn't registered before the deadline, register to vote, and vote all at one time. Simply put, you complete your voting process at one stop. Just that easy. Has been great, and it may or may not be under fire right now. Depends on who you talk to in the General Assembly. We've got a Republican General Assembly. Both houses of our General Assembly turned Republican last year for the first time in like 100 and some years, before voter registration probably, and so they may be changing some things, but we continue to plod on, and we're administrators, so we'll administer whatever they tell us to do on that process. But basically, voter registration in our business has been the same for the last 20 or 30 years. Currently, if you're applying to vote in North Carolina, we verify who you are to vote, who you are. On the front end of the registration form, you give us your name, your address, all that information. You also give us the last 4 digits of your Social Security number or your North Carolina driver's license. And we check that against the DMV, and they verify that you are the person that you are on this application. So you would have had to have personal information on me to be able to do that. To verify where you live, we use the United States Postal Service. It's the best thing we've got. We send out a card, and if the card does not come back, it is presumed that card reached its destination. If the card comes back, it triggers as undeliverable. It will trigger some other information for us to do, some research, and we may have to try sending a new card, all what you have to do. That has worked, and it's worked well. With same-day registration, though, at early voting sites, we prove who you are on the front end, and we prove your residency on the front end instead of your residency necessarily on the back end. First, your proof of residency. This is required of all same-day registrations. You walk in with me with a government photo ID that shows your address. If you don't have that, give me your Verizon telephone bill. Give me your gas bill, your electric bill, something that has your name and your address on it. At that point in time, somebody else has already done all the proof of residency for us. I guarantee you, you're not going to have a Verizon phone if Verizon doesn't know where your home address is. So that's what we do. Anything that's got your name and address, we can prove the residency. Then on the back end, we're going to be able to prove who you are by checking your name with the Social Security number and the last four digits of your Social Security number or your North Carolina driver's ID number. We'll be able to check that to say this is the person who is in there. And keep in mind, all one-stop early votes in our office are retrievable. So if we did have a problem, we would be able to retrieve that ballot, and that does happen in the past. Same-day registration is only permitted during early voting. It's not carried forward to election day. Early voting is administered to the absentee, so we're retrievable. And when the same-day voter application is completed at the early voting site, our office is mandated to start the voter verification process within 2 days. So I can't just get that voter registration in from an early voting site and let it sit there. I have to, by law, start that voting process within start that registration process within 2 days. We'll search for possible duplicates. We'll search for registrations in another county or somewhere else in the state of North Carolina. And if we locate the duplicate voter or that determine that the voter is not qualified to vote because they may be convicted of a felony or something of that, we can then retrieve their ballot and not count their vote. Greatest benefit to early voting or to same-day registration is good customer service again. Our goal is to vote voters. As simple as that sounds, our goal is to vote voters. That's what we're in the business of doing. Us, well, you and I are, Maggie.
Yes,
these
we are.
other ones, no.
They want to help.
Yeah. Another nice feature is that it puts your data capture out in the field. If I'm doing voter registration with 300 people out in the early voting sites, I'm not putting those 300 people in my office trying to capture the data. I've only got about 8,000 square feet in my office. I don't have room to put another 300 people in there. Not only are you capturing that data out there, the voter is verifying that data as being accurate. So I think your turnaround rate or your return rate on those are going to be a lot less than what you have if somebody walks up to you on the street and says, here, do you want to fill out a voter registration application? Yeah, it might work, but they may not like that. It might not give you all the accurate information. The other nice feature is the reduction of work it provides and you election administrators after the election. It is fantastic to be done with an election within a week after the election and have the whole thing canvassed and out of your way. Prior to our first year of same-day registration, we had in 2008 presidential election, we reached 6,000 provisional ballots, the last presidential election. 6,000, that's 6,000 people that went out and thought they had registered and were not registered. 6,000 showed up, and you're administering that after. It takes you a long time to put in that 6,000 and try to figure out how many and what you can do. Now keep in mind our voting population back then was about 500,000 voters in 2008. Our voter registration was. 2012 was 650,000 registered voters. We only had 3,000 provisional voters. So you reduced your number of provisional work time after the election in half. Makes all the difference as you're trying to tie up loose ends, you're trying to produce a result, and you're trying to get everything done before the election. You can't beat, before canvass, you can't beat that, that fact that you've reduced your election time down to half of what it was 4 years ago or 8 years ago. That's godsend. I think that if you look at a same-day registration and the registration process, again, we have been doing this the same way for the last 20, 30, 40 years. We do have technology now that lets us do things electronically. We don't need to concentrate or focus just on putting everything on paper. We can record this electronically and get this information out to everybody electronically. We print our poll books the Saturday night before the election. It's a quite simple process. Like I say, 650,000 voters. We have them printed, and we'll send a paper poll book out to each precinct on election day that's already marked with all these voters in them, that they voted early or they've already taken care of their process, their voting, so they can't vote again. We do that the Saturday night before the election, after we close all of our election early voting down, so that everything is updated and accurate as it goes out. I think it's much more current, and we're hoping to get, as Maggie has, the election day poll books. We're just waiting for the right one we like, so we'll be there. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Maggie Toulouse Oliver, who we've already heard from, the clerk of Bernalillo County, New Mexico. Like North Carolina, New Mexico has electronic poll books, and New Mexico, as I mentioned, also recently passed a bill that would automate the voter registration process at Department of Motor Vehicles so that the process will be seamless and paperless for voters and election officials alike. And I should note that this was a bipartisan effort. The sponsors of the bill included both a Republican and a Democrat, and this does follow a lot of the patterns that we've seen in the states with modernizing voter registration. And turn it over to Maggie.
Thank you, Wendy. Okay, sorry, technology calls once again. Oh. All right, I'll vamp a little bit. Okay, so hi, it's me again. So maybe I won't vamp. As I already mentioned before, and I'll have it again on this slide, but again, we have about 2 million folks in New Mexico. 1.2 million or so of those are registered voters across 33 counties, and I already talked to you a lot about my particular county. You know, if North Carolina is sort of the grown adult of voter registration, oh, look at that. New Mexico is sort of the awkward teenager. We are making some great strides, and this year in particular we had some great successes, which I'll talk about, but we're also still bringing up the rear in some areas. Let me just talk generally about voter registration. Currently we have pretty much an all-paper voter registration system with a couple of exceptions that I'll talk about. We do have extensive use of third-party voter registration agents in the state. And you know, one of the things that Michael talked about, the advantage of same-day registration, I would love for us to get there in New Mexico, is that particularly because if you see my second to last point, we use a full social security number as a unique identifier. That's your required ID for voter registration in New Mexico. People feel very uncomfortable giving that information to a third-party agent, even if they're certified, even if they have a letter that's notarized from me saying that they've been trained and whatnot. I mean, I would feel weird about it, and I know exactly how this process works. But we do have extensive use of third-party agents. My office works. We do a ton of third-party registration training and certification, especially during a presidential year. My office will process, you know, this last year we processed around 65,000 voter registrations through my office. In 2008, I think we did about 80,000. Currently, New Mexico is under a consent decree for a lack of HAVA enforcement prior to 2010. Our MVDs and state agencies simply were not compliant with HAVA. They were not offering the opportunity for an individual to register at those agencies, and so probably several of the individuals in this room helped in bringing that lawsuit, which now, thank you, for me, thank you, that basically created the new criteria under which the agencies are operating, but I'll talk a little bit about how that pertains to MVD here in a minute. And we don't require identification on the front end to register in New Mexico other than what's required in HAVA. We utilize ES&S's Power Profile statewide voter registration database. I hate it. It's horrible. It was the first one that ES&S ever developed. So we had, you know, the experimental one, and now all the other states that have benefited from our pilot project have nice fancy turbo ones, and we have, you know, the Yugo. And it was developed in 2004. It's horribly unuser friendly. It's problematic in a number of ways. ES&S charges insane amounts of money to make any sort of functionality changes, and if ultimately, ideally, in New Mexico, we'll develop an in-house voter registration database eventually. That is my personal goal. How we accomplish that remains to be seen. It does interface with state vital statistics and corrections, so if you pass away, ideally that information will integrate itself into the database, or if you're convicted of a felony, and sometimes if you were convicted in the 70s, it'll pop back up again right before an election, which is super fun. We have a lot of issues with that. Clerks may currently access the MVD database. DMV is MVD in our state, in case that's not clear for whatever reason. We can verify Social Security numbers, but we can't invalidate your registration on that basis. Really what that's helpful for is if we have a duplicate situation, which we often do because people are not thinking about the information they're putting on the page when they register. They're thinking about their grocery list or the 50 errands they need to run, and sometimes don't even write their birth date down properly or their name or their address, much less their social. And there is, again, no automatic updating of registration at state agencies. It's that paper process. We do have some cool stuff going on. This last year, we had a great new development. A firm called EvoT developed this iPad and tablet app for voter registration. Some of you may be familiar with it. EvoT's principal, Jason Lebersky, is actually from New Mexico, and so this was one of the first places that it was rolled out. So basically, the app utilizes the federal registration form. The fields are pre-programmed to the state's requirements. So for example, the ID number in New Mexico is the social, so that will sort of pop up as what's required. If it's something different in your state, it would say that. Only when all the fields are complete and the boxes are checked can the form be submitted. It's populated, you do your signature with the stylus. That was one thing we had to sort of make sure that state law was kosher with that. It was. And then that form gets emailed to our office and we print it out and enter it into our system. So we did a couple of hundred voter registrations this way. I mean, it's still kind of newfangled technology. People are still kind of weirded out by that, but 200 brave souls took advantage and got registered that way, and we're very happy with it. Let me talk about what we're doing to move forward now that I've gotten all my gripes out of the way about New Mexico and our voter registration system. There we go. So we have this great election administration legislative coalition in New Mexico that I have been a part of for several years now. And there are certain individual county clerks, including myself, that are a part of it. Common Cause is a hugely active member. In fact, Vicki, I wish she could have been here, but Vicki Harrison, who's our New Mexico State Director, and I worked very closely this last legislative session. The League of Women Voters, the Center for Civic Policy, the ACLU, New Mexico Vote Matters, which was probably our #1 vehicle for voter registration in New Mexico in 2012, Labor, and Verified Voting / United Voters of New Mexico. We all worked very closely together on a package of voter modernization, registration modernization legislation in 2013. We had some successes. Our first bill that we introduced was pre-registration of 16 and 17-year-olds. Which would also permit those 17-year-olds who will be 18 on election day in the general to vote in the primary election. We actually, interestingly, this was the first bill that was up for a hearing, the first bill that was introduced, and it was moving the most quickly, and it ultimately, I mean, it came just short of passing. It just got hung up. Senate Judiciary, all of your legislatures have that Roach Motel committee, the bills go in and they never come out. That's Senate Judiciary in New Mexico, and so we got it all that way, and it died. It could not make it out, right? So unfortunately, but it really was we had this great conversation about, and it was very bipartisan. We had these really diehard Republicans, this high school teacher I was talking to someone about Farmington earlier, but from Farmington, New Mexico, very conservative part of the state, and he was waxing eloquent on these young people being able to vote in the primary. And of course, the ideal is if we get these people on the books early, by the time they come of age, they're already registered, they can go and vote, and then it becomes, a habit. We had a great kid who's actually a poll worker. We allow 16 and 17-year-olds to work the polls in New Mexico, and we had this great kid from Santa Fe who he had a flat top, like this giant flat top, and anyway, he was talking about how voting was like a drug, but a good drug. It's habit forming, but it's a good habit. He was awesome too. We had great kids who helped advocate this bill. So it was great for the conversation and about just getting people involved in voting at a young age. We did also, as Wendy mentioned, have great success with the automation of the registration at Motor Vehicle Division. And so now, once this is implemented, when you go in to get your license, they're not going to give you a piece of paper that you may or may not fill out. It's going to be, you know, a touch screen thing. The form will be pre-populated with all of your data from MVD. Basically, all you have to go is, you know, pick a party, if you so choose, and sign it, and then it will get electronically transmitted to both our offices and the Secretary of State's office, which is nice because we sort of have that dual accountability mechanism there. We had a lot of problems in 2012 with individuals claiming that they registered at the Motor Vehicle Division. And ironically, we have one at Kirtland Air Force Base in Albuquerque, and that was like the worst offender, which I just, for whatever reason, I thought that was so ironic. But we had a lot of people who were issued provisional ballots, and like Michael was saying, that's a huge problem. People think they're registered and they're showing up to vote, and they can't vote because they're not on the rolls, and we have to reject their ballot. That's like the worst thing as an election administrator. I never want to have to do that. So fortunately, and this did have a Republican sponsor, a gentleman from the rural East Mountain part of my county that I was telling you all about. He's a high school teacher as well, and this was signed into law by Governor Martinez, who is a Republican as well. Last but not least, we successfully passed a bill to allow for voters to update their voter registration online. So I think in New Mexico, as in many other places, we're very much an incremental baby steps kind of place. Technology kind of freaks people out, especially some of the legislators from the more rural part of the state. And so we didn't want to go full bore into doing voter registration originating voter registrations online, but allowing people to update their address. You know, I would estimate that anywhere from 20 to 25% of my voter rolls are out of date at any given time based on bad addresses. And this is one of the reasons why ultimately we want to get on board, well, I do, with what Sam's going to talk about with Eric. But you know, just allowing those folks to have an easy, convenient way to update their address, I think is going to be huge. It's going to save money. It's going to make our rolls a lot more accurate. And as I said, we're getting there. We're in the adolescence in New Mexico, but we're definitely proceeding rapidly toward adulthood. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Our next speaker is Sam Durheimer, who is Manager of Election Initiatives. Oh, I'm sorry, at Pew Charitable Trust. We're skipping the order because I'm going in the order of the panel here. He has been there since 2008. Among other things, he works on the ERIC project, which helps states maintain the accuracy of their voter rolls and expand voter registration access. It uses technology and helps to create more current and accurate voter registration rolls.
Thank you, Wendy. And I also want to echo the previous thank yous to Common Cause, specifically Susan and Sam and the rest of your staff. I really appreciate being here. And if the emails I keep receiving from the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights are accurate, today is, I guess, the 20th anniversary of the NVRA. So I think it's an appropriate day to be here on this panel discussing these issues. So for those of you who aren't as familiar with Pew, we're an independent nonprofit driven by empirical research and data to solve our nation's most challenging problems. At Pew, we apply a really rigorous analytical approach to improve public policy and to inform the public. And so we got involved with voter registration a little over 4 years ago after the 2008 election, when we heard from election officials, state and local, from the campaigns, and from voting advocacy groups that voter registration was not working as it should, that the system was inefficient, the system was clunky, and the system was expensive, and that it was ripe for reform and for an upgrade. It was time to upgrade the system. So we began to look at voter registration, and we studied a lot of the problems that caused the complaints we heard about after 2008. We did a lot of research into the system, the process, and where the inefficiencies and where the hurdles pop up, which I can go into maybe more in the question and answer period. But this is the end result. This is actually data from the 2012 survey of the performance of American elections. And what we found was that about 3.5 million voters experienced a problem that had to be solved before they could cast a ballot in 2008. So that represents just shy of 3% of all voters in this nation. Now, additionally, there were over 1 million voters who were prevented from casting a ballot at all. These were eligible voters who thought they had registered, showed up to their polls to try to vote, and were denied a ballot. That number, that 1.2 million, doesn't count the number of voters who simply missed a deadline and so didn't bother trying. The number of voters who checked their registration status after the deadline, found an inaccuracy, or found a piece of information that was out of date that they knew would prevent them from casting a ballot, and so didn't show up. These are the voters that actually tried to vote and were prevented. So with information like that, back after 2008, we convened a kind of working group to study voter registration and propose possible solutions. At least 1 or 2 members of that working group are actually in this audience right now. And with the direction and input from election officials, we came up with a set of recommendations. The first is that all states should move to online voter registration. I'm not going to spend too much time on that because there's an entire panel on it later this afternoon. But what we found was that online registration results in more accurate data, in a more efficient process, and it's a hell of a lot cheaper than paper registration. We also recommend automating the motor voter registration process, which Maggie just spoke about, so I'm not going to go too much into that either. And finally, what I am going to spend the rest of my time talking today about is better data sharing between the states. So with our series, with our working group, we came up with an idea that we labeled the Electronic Registration Information Center, that we lovingly refer to as ERIC. And ERIC was born of the idea of what if you could give states access to more and better data and the advanced tools to actually make sense and act on that data. So ERIC was born out of that idea, and it was a group of 7 pioneering states that got together voluntarily. ERIC is owned, controlled, and managed by those 7 states. And what it is a sophisticated data matching tool. So ERIC is not a list. ERIC is not a list of voter registration list, any kind of national list. ERIC is a tool that helps states get better information on the voters in their jurisdictions. And then consistent with the NVRA and consistent with state practices, states can act on that data, reach out to voters to update their registration when necessary, or to reach out to new eligible voters in their jurisdiction. From the very beginning, privacy and security were built from the core outward of the system. We actually sent our system design to the Center for Democracy and Technology before it was ever built to get input from them, and we took a lot of their recommendations into consideration when the system was built. So to participate, states need to, at a minimum, supply the voter registration files and their motor vehicle files. ERIC then also brings in Social Security data, data from the U.S. Postal Service, the NCOA, the National Change of Address, and has the capability to bring in other data if states would choose. So the more states' data put in, the more information they're going to get out. So for instance, if they want to put in their Health and Human Service records, ERIC is built to take that information and match it along with all the others. And so what they get then is the high quality data on voters who have moved in-state or out of state, voters who have died, duplicate records that represent the same voter, and uniquely, it's going to identify eligible but unregistered citizens in the state. Now, this has never been done before, or at least it's certainly never been done on a sophisticated level like this. What you're going to get is voters who have gone in and told the DMV in their state that they now live and registered and have a residence in your state, but haven't registered yet. They don't have a matching file with the election offices. States can use that information to reach out to these voters, educating them on how to register, pushing them towards more efficient ways to register, like online registration, and do it earlier in the election calendar. So rather than that crush of election registration forms that come in right before a deadline, election officials will have the opportunity to reach out to them earlier, maybe a month, maybe 2 months earlier, when election officials aren't so swamped with all the other duties it takes to run a state or federal election.
That would be great.
So these are the 7 pioneering states of ERIC. You'll notice some geographic and political diversity up there. You'll also notice that there are kind of 2 clumps. Really, you're going to notice that because states have an incentive to bring on their neighbors. Research shows that the most likely indicator of a voter registration problem is mobility. The more times you move, the more times you interact with the election office, the more times there's a potential to have an error in your voter record. So, I think New York probably gets people from all over the country and world, but most states see the most mobility from their neighboring states. So, a great example is I live in D.C. People move between Maryland, Virginia, and Washington, D.C. on a monthly basis. The same person could move to all 3 in 1 year. I've actually known that to happen. And Maryland would love to know when their voter leaves and moves to Alexandria, Virginia. Virginia would love to know that they have a new eligible voter in their jurisdiction that probably isn't going to register until about a couple days before the deadline when human reaction remembers, I got to register to vote. So it's going to help lower that crush of registrations that happen right at a deadline. And so what are these 7 states getting from ERIC? And that is going to come up in a second. They're getting better data and the tools to manage that data. Last year, our 7 ERIC states shared data and found over 5.7 million voters that they could contact and educate on how to register. Over 300,000 did. In Colorado, for example, 40,000 voters who were contacted by the state with a nonpartisan, educational information that directed them online rather than paper, registered to vote in time to cast a ballot in the 2012 presidential election. Now, they also get information on voters who may need to update their registration. In just the 7 states, over 100,000 individuals who moved to another state, one of the other 7 states, were identified. And consistent with the NVRA, states could reach out to those individuals to have them update their record. So again, the more states you add on, that number is only going to increase. These 100,000 were only between the 7 ERIC states. And that is the broad overview of ERIC. It's a simple concept. Give election officials more data. Give election officials the tools to manage and make sense of that data. And you're going to see more data go out from the election officials. It's going to improve the accuracy of voter records. It's going to increase the efficiency with which voters can navigate the registration process. And ultimately, it's going to cause less problems on election day. So that is the broad overview. I'll answer any questions during the question and answer period, and happy to answer anything offline too.
Thank you so much. And our last speaker is going to also come from the perspective of a private group that's helping use more modern tools to make the voter registration process work better, this time in addition to helping election officials, and this group is focusing on helping citizens interface with the voter registration process. The speaker is Paul Commoners. He is the research director at TurboVote. TurboVote uses an innovative approach to helping citizens register and vote, including building software and using online interfaces to do things like sending citizens reminders, requests for absentee ballots, and other voter registration reminders. It seeks to emulate Netflix. This past election, more than 190,000 voters started using TurboVote, including over 35,000 students at 58 partner colleges. Thank you, and I'll turn it over to Paul.
First of all, I would like to say thanks for having us here, and I'd especially like to thank Wendy for getting my last name right on the first try, which nobody ever does. So TurboVote broadly attempts to simplify and streamline how citizens interact with elections. We track people's election calendars, we send them filled-in forms with addressed stamped envelopes by mail for them to sign and drop in the mail. So we think we are literally making getting registered to vote and also requesting absentee ballots as easy as getting a DVD from Netflix. we're also the much beleaguered USPS is actually some of our best friends because, you know, we put 100,000 forms in the mail. They get them all where they're supposed to be going. We use what's called an API that the USPS puts out to check to make sure that the addresses that everybody has given us are real addresses, and like Mecklenburg County, as long as the mail doesn't come back to us, we tend to trust that things are working out. One aspect of modernization that we do that I'd like to talk about is what we do at our partner schools. Modernization doesn't just mean improvement of technology. In a lot of cases, it means taking existing technology and putting it in new places to reach new audiences and new constituencies. And one thing that we've found and realized is that every college in the United States, you know, has a student information system, has a class registration process, has a freshman orientation. And these seem like sort of silly observations at first glance. And then you realize that that's a place that you can build in voter registration, voter education, and voter engagement. So we're in the midst of an initiative to try to get every college in the United States, or as close to that as possible, to build voter registration and voter education into their freshman orientation and class registration processes so that everybody who comes through the college has a chance to vote. Like Maggie's flat-topped kid, I think, said, voting is habit forming. And a lot of, what?
It's a drag.
Yeah. And, well, I hesitate to make a drugs crack about and freshman year of college, but college is, a lot of people in the United States do pass through colleges, and so if we can get them at the very beginning to start forming that voting habit, that's a great place to do it. And we're even happier with places that are letting high school students pre-register and get started there. The earlier we can get people voting, the better. Another thing I'd like to talk about briefly is online voter registration systems. I know there is a panel on that later, so I'll try not to take too long on them, but we've also been able to integrate with a number of voter registration services, or state-provided online voter registration. What I mean when I say we integrated, we took the interface that was put in place, we take the voters' information that we've been given, and we essentially plug the voters' information into the online interface, prompting the voter for any additional information as it's needed. This is wonderful because it frankly lets us save paper, save a step. We get better verification from an online system than we do from mailing forms out to voters. So if there's a problem, we discover it much faster and the entire thing goes faster. However, we're not able to integrate with everything because a lot of these systems are fairly locked down. New York's, unfortunately, is one of those. Everything is run through the state's MyDMV system, which is harder to get into than, for example, the Maryland system, which we love working with. The last thing that I'd like to talk about briefly is sharing across offices. So we actually just sent out a team from a government service design firm called The Reboot, of whom one member is in attendance, Jeremy Canfield over there, to talk to 6 different election offices for a week. They did on-sites, they talked to members, the staffs at every level, and learned what they were doing, how they were using technology, where their existing pain points are, where the pain points are that they're so used to at this point that they don't even feel like pain points, and start thinking about, so that we can start thinking about what kinds of tools we can start designing for local governments so that we can be serving them as well as we can serve individual voters. And broadly, one of the things that we found is that there's actually not nearly as, so there are data deficiencies, as Eric is working on. There also just isn't much information sharing across jurisdictional lines. So, you know, if Bernalillo County is doing wonderful things, that doesn't necessarily spill over into the adjacent counties nearly as much as it should. So also, not everyone has a community of technologists like big cities often do. And so a lot of the communities that are more rural or more isolated don't have access to the opportunities to build technology and build cleaner and more efficient tools that New York does, or Bernalillo County does, or Charlotte, North Carolina does. So we're planning on working on building portable, configurable software for different local election offices so that they can tap into the sort of resources that New York has available and that Albuquerque has available. And I think that's most of what I'd like to say about TurboVote, and I'll hand it over to Wendy so she can start questions.
Great. So I am going to, again, take the moderator's privilege and start with 2 questions. I'll ask them one at a time. The first has to do with automation and just making the voter registration process at motor vehicle offices and other voter registration agencies more electronic and seamless. I think everybody is in either a jurisdiction that has it, will have it, or is working on promoting the use of that. The Brennan Center conducted a study in 2010 that found that automation, as well as online registration, has a number of benefits. It actually increases voter registration rates at those agencies. It reduces costs for voter registration, and it reduces dramatically the error rates in the voter registration process. That was sort of looking across all the jurisdictions that had that at that time. I wanted to see if that both comported with your experience, and if so, if you can talk about how and why that is the case in your jurisdiction.
Automation with the DMV works like a champ. When the DMV 20 years ago first started doing voter registration, they did a great job at giving people a driver's license. They didn't do a great job at getting people registered to vote. It wasn't their job. I think they walked into it sort of with a gun held to their head, and they didn't really want to do that. Now it's a much more amicable approach. They're willing to do things, and now the question they will ask, are you registered? They don't have to type something else in. They just have to simply ask the question, do you want to register to vote? And yes, it prints out for them, and we electronically receive it at our office with all the data already pre-entered into the data fields. That's the key for us. I'm not trying to do data entry around a big voter registration push right around the presidential election. That has helped tremendously in our county. The seamless approach to voter registration. But we've noticed too that not only with DMV, but you've got partners like the League of Women Voters, I think that is here. They've gone and they've attacked these voters, these young voters in high schools. With your graduation here, you get a voter registration application. They literally attack them. Don't forget to do this. You talked about new voters. The League of Women Voters has somebody at the swearing-in ceremonies for everybody becoming a citizen. And proudest day of their life, they're also going to be able to vote. So that's fantastic. Maggie?
I think it's so funny, we're psychically linked. He sort of sets it up, and then I don't have to go over all that stuff again. Again, I agree with everything you said. It's just the election administrator thing, I think. The problem that we have in New Mexico and that we've been having is that, so the state agencies are required under NVRA to, of course, provide the opportunity for voters to register, but they have little to no training, and that was part of why the consent decree was brought on the state. I haven't seen that situation greatly improve, to be quite frank with you all. That being said, what we've done in Bernalillo County, and again, being the largest county, and I have resources that a lot of the other counties don't have, is I actually have a dedicated staff person called an NVRA coordinator, and among other things, his job is to literally go around to all of the MVDs, including the private ones, and collect the voter registration forms from them. And you can, I think it's, the problem with that is evident, right? These are paper forms, and so they can fall behind a desk, and they can get stuck in between the car seat, and they can, they can disappear in a puff of smoke. I mean, so the problem is that even though there's a lot of really good faith work happening, that for reasons often beyond our control, either those registrations don't make it to our office or they're incomplete. And we can't get them processed, and so then you end up having people who don't make it onto the rolls and then can't vote or have to vote a provisional ballot. So again, I'm really looking forward to this automation process. I think it's going to do all of the things that Wendy talked about in New Mexico, and I'll be looking forward to reporting on the very positive results at some point in the near future.
So I spend most of my time thinking about this from the voter side of things and how to take as much pain out of the process as possible for voters. And what I love about automation and online registration is that it takes most of the pain points out. If your forms are filled in with information that you've provided elsewhere, there is less likelihood that you are going to incorrectly fill out your forms when you're duplicating the information. If the feedback is instantaneous, you're not waiting for this black box to happen where you put your form in the mail. A couple of days later, it gets to the voter registration office. They process your form. If there's an error, they might call you or they might send a postcard back, which takes another couple days to get to you. And especially if you're one of the people who's put it off to, until the last minute, which many, if not most people are, every day that you lose resolving an error is, frankly, fairly precious in getting you registered to vote and getting you able to vote. So if I'm signing up to vote online and it's pulling information it already has on me from somewhere else, or if, as TurboVote, we're taking the information you've given us and putting it into an online system, we figure out instantaneously whether or not this has succeeded, because either you hit the final step and it says you're good, or you hit the final step and it says, I'm sorry, there's a problem. And that makes it much easier to try to backtrack, fix it, and get successfully registered to vote. So from the voters side of things, this is a wonderful thing to have in place to make the process of getting registered less painful and to increase the number of registrants.
So speaking forth, I'm only going to quickly echo a lot of what was already said. It's automating specifically motor voter agencies is something that Pew is looking into right now. It's something we're very interested in finding kind of best practices and lessons learned for the states who have already gotten there, for the states who are working to get there. But what we know is that automating that process is going to eliminate the biggest cost drivers for states. It's going to take less paper, it's going to take less mail, and it's going to take less temporary staff whose sole reason for being hired is to sit at a computer and hand enter paper forms. For instance, Delaware, who might get the kind of gold star of automating their motor vehicle agencies with their election offices, saves about $250,000 a year between the two state agencies. It's also automating that motor voter link is going to eliminate the potential for error in the data, as was mentioned several times. You remove that human who's sitting there and could very easily put in 1221 Smith Street as 1122 Smith Street, and the voter might not be able to be found in the poll books. And it's also going to eliminate clerk discretion at the motor vehicle agencies. We've looked at the data across the country, and I think no one will be surprised that success rate for voters getting registered at motor vehicle agencies varies wildly across the state. Some states do it significantly better than others. Some states simply do a better job of training their DMV clerks to do this job. I think, anecdotally, we all have a story of going into a government agency and not really getting the full service we expected. Specifically, sometimes when clerks are rated on how quickly they move through transactions. If a DMV clerk is sitting there thinking, voter registration is not my primary function, I can lower my transaction time and look better to my boss if I kind of don't do it. Now, I'm certainly not saying that that happens often or that happens nationwide, but we've all had that experience where it's happened to someone we've known. So eliminating those flaws in the process is going to ultimately result in more accurate data getting through and more people being accurately registered.
Thank you. And my second question has to do with privacy and security in particular. You've all talked about using more technology in a variety of ways to improve the processes, including technology that gets linked up online or through other networks. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about what kinds of protections your systems have against hacking, and how it is that you have made the public comfortable with the security of the systems that are otherwise so valuable.
Our state operates a statewide voter registration database. We're actually, any one of you can go online right now and download the entire statewide voter registration database. Security is that I have to produce a public record of your voter registration. And I do. I have to keep confidential driver's license numbers. I have to keep confidential Social Security numbers, electronic signatures. All those must be kept confidential. So we put it out there for anybody, the candidates, the committees, to go through and actually pull whatever they want off of our voter registration. It's nice because now that is the official record for North Carolina. So if you ask for voter registration, I give you that. I don't give you the voter registration card that somebody filled out and has all their cell phone numbers on it and everything else. I've got your name, address, your party registered, when you registered, when was the last time you voted. All that information is out there. So instead of worrying about security, we produced what we wanted to be secure. And that's what, in North Carolina, we produce and put out on the website for anybody to download the voter registration. So it makes it quite easy for us on that back end. We just make sure you don't ever give somebody's personal information out.
So our voter registration database is, well, let me back up. The protected private information in our voter registration database is, of course, the Social Security number and the date of birth, but not the year of birth. So those are the two protected pieces that have to be kept confidential. We also have a secure registration system in New Mexico for individuals who for whatever reason, need to keep their address off the books, and those are primarily, victims of domestic violence and that type of a situation. Also, some of our judges prefer to keep their addresses private to avoid, retribution and whatnot. So we have, we utilize a secure server. The Secretary of State's office has a secure server. We have a gateway process. We have to go through a Citrix secure connection with an initial username and password to be able to log into the secure server, at which point we have a second username and password. So any individual that's being issued these being issued the username and password to be able to access have to be a verified employee of a clerk's office. So that's the basic. Those are the basics without getting into too much techno geek detail. On the one thing that's been discussed quite extensively is with this new automated process with the MVD, how that's going to work. And basically, we have an advocate who many of you in the room are familiar with, Paul Stokes from Verified Voting, United Voters of New Mexico, and he actually had it written into the law that we utilize NIST standards in terms of the security of that process. And so that will be developed working with the state IT division.
So we're lucky in that as an outside organization, we don't actually have to collect any information that we don't want to be responsible for keeping safe. So we actually don't collect driver's license numbers, Social Security numbers, or other ID numbers that states mandate. That is one of the only pieces of information we have voters fill in themselves other than their signature. So we get around that particular problem by just never touching it and leaving it in the voters' hands. Outside of that, we just try to obey general security best practices. Voters connect to our site over HTTPS. We've had security reviews done of our site by third-party organizations. And generally, we just try to stick to what's known to be good to keep things as secure as they can be.
I think it's really important also to, when you're looking at how to modernize your voter registration system, it's key to compare security and privacy to the current system of paper, right? When people register, they're putting their name, their address, their driver's license, maybe the last 4 digits of their social security on a piece of paper and likely handing it over to a complete stranger. When you move to online registration, you're eliminating that third party who's getting your information. And I'm not saying that people are necessarily using that information nefariously, but there is the opportunity if someone would want to. So going back to Eric to talk without getting too technical, because I am a lawyer, not an engineer, we built privacy and security in from the core out. As I said, we actually have a full report from the Center for Democracy and Technology. If you go to pewstates.org/voterreg, that report is on our website. You can find it and read all of their recommendations that were incorporated into the administration of ERIC and to the technology of ERIC. But to mention them very briefly, our hosting server site is extremely secure. ERIC's data is hosted at a same site that several national banks host their data. I don't know of a more secure data hosting facility in the country. There are all kinds of security firewalls that are more technical than I understand built into the system that were the recommendations of CDT and our IBM engineers who built the system. And most importantly, before the data ever leaves state control, we do a process called anonymization of that data. So unlike encryption, which is built to be decrypted, once you anonymize something, it can never go back to its original data. Our IBM engineers use the example of turning a pig into sausage. The DNA is the same, but that sausage is never turning back into that pig. So that data, maybe a last 4 of a social security number, might get turned into a 20-digit string of characters. If that data ever comes from another location, it's going to turn into that same digit of 20 characters. It's great for matching, but if someone would ever break into ERIC, all they're going to get is a string of illegible characters. So that it can be reported back to the states, we matched this field, but you're not going to necessarily know what that field was from the other state's data. A state will only ever get the data that it already had. So as I said, the security and privacy was built in from the very beginning. It's great for matching, but it's not going to be so great for hackers.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I'm going to turn it over to the audience for questions now. I'll also note that every state does now, or with the exception of California, have a statewide voter registration database that is connected to other the state databases by law, with security protections mandated by federal law as well. So I just want to flag that.
Hi, I'm Philip Stark from California. Following up on this question and on things that have been said by the various panelists, and you pointed out that there's a large amount of disenfranchisement that comes from errors in voter registration databases or incompleteness. You pointed out with Eric that there's like 1 million people who didn't get to vote as a result of errors. Putting the communication of this stuff over the internet opens the door to widespread disenfranchisement by a bad actor who wants to mess with US elections. Front page of the New York Times today was about the Chinese military hackers. If you gave me a team of 4 smart computer science undergraduates, 2 weeks, and legal immunity, I could use Eric to tell the state of Nevada that all of their voters had moved to Seattle. I could change the addresses of every registered voter in the state of New Mexico. I mean, this is just, the vulnerability of this is enormous. The kinds of security that you're talking about putting in place might help for privacy of information, but the assumption is that people are basically good actors, and that people lack, and that there isn't a concerted group of bad actors with a relatively modest amount of resources who wants to mess with it. So, you know, the DMV does a good job at what they do. If you were talking about doing everything over some secure channel between DMV and your registration database without any kind of public-facing anything, so basically just a virtual private network with no web-facing interface, no internet-facing interface, it might be possible to secure these things. But if you're allowing voters to do things for themselves online, the kind of web services that are involved in that are just inherently vulnerable. There's just nothing that can be done about this. So I very much appreciate the fact that there's a lot of friction in the system, and we need to do something to remove the friction so that voters can get registered, can correct their information, so forth and so on. But this particular approach of doing things online really, really worries me. I think it's just an enormous vulnerability.
I'll just start by noting that much online registration is going to be the subject of the next panel. So to the extent, I mean, if people want to address this, let's leave a lot of the online registration discussion for next panel. But I do also want to reiterate that you know, to the extent that there's the system is insufficiently secure, and there are always more security measures. It's already so, given the statewide voter registration databases that we have in place, and using those databases more effectively to make the system more accurate and complete is not going to markedly increase that insecurity. But I'll turn it over to the panelists. And
I just want to point out, there's a very big difference between saying, here's a copy of it online, like you're saying, it's there, it's downloadable, anybody can look at it, and saying that there are things people can do to alter it. So having a sort of a read-only copy is one thing, but having the systems that are involved in updating information, transmitting information to the internet is something.
yeah, so I'll turn it over to the panelists, and I will add that just from the studies of all the states that have done a lot of these kinds of modernization efforts, there's always a person involved somewhere in the process. So even if there are electronic systems used to transmit information from one source to another, election officials still review and determine whether or not that information is going to make it onto their voter registration databases. But we'll talk about how it happens in the various jurisdictions and with Eric.
If I can go real quick, you're exactly right. Everything we do has to have a paper signature with it before I can do anything to somebody's voter registration, even if it's from another state or another jurisdiction that says Vermont has got 50 of your voters in there already, you can remove them. I need a paper trail to be able to do all of that. At one point in time, you couldn't stop and get rid of everybody. But that is the major concern about this. How do I keep it and protect it? Everybody I've talked to, they want you to show an ID to vote, but by gosh, I don't want a national ID.
Right.
So you've developed a pretty hybrid system right there, where I can go to it with this ID and show it to Mecklenburg County, but I don't want to have to use it for any other thing to get me on an airplane or anything like that. I don't want anything like that. So I don't think you're going to get rid of the paper all the way. It was like early voting when we first started early voting in Mecklenburg County. I said, it's a great idea, great idea. Let's push it. We're going to get rid of all our precincts. I was approached by both parties and said, we don't care how many early voting sites you put out there. Never get rid of precinct on Election Day. You're forgetting, Election Day is still an event, Michael. It's an event. I get dressed up and I go down and vote on Election Day. And that's like this. I still need something to follow me. The DMV transaction is working great. But I still need a piece of paper that says Maggie is not registered in New Mexico anymore. She's now in Charlotte, North Carolina.
So that question, and Phil is one of my favorite people to debate with. That question reminds me a little bit of poll worker training. So we get these, well, what if this should happen? What if green aliens come out of the sky? And, well, then we have a lot bigger problems than how we're going to run the election on Election Day. I'll tell you that. I mean, I think what you're talking about, the type of scenario you're talking about, is unrealistic to the extent that obviously if somebody was interested in hacking into a system and making changes that were for the purpose of throwing an election, so to speak, that they would ideally try to do it in some sort of an undetectable way, something that massively detectable. Again, going back to what Michael said, we have paper records. We also have replication. We have multiple databases, multiple servers. So we have different ways to sort of recover data. So if something like what you described were to happen, it would be really obvious. We'd all figure it out, and we'd all be able to say some massive weirdness happened with the system, and we can restore. But something more undetectable and more on the sly would be the issue. And I think we have there are two safeguards in place for something like what you described. Number one, of course, there is, again, the paper record. So if there's ever a question by a voter at the polls about whether they are, should be on the rolls or whether they are registered properly or the information. I had a county commissioner come and vote early, and squealed bloody murder because, you know, he kept telling us his birth date and it was not the date, and sure enough he had actually written it wrong on his form, but we had that paper form to go back to. He was one of those guys thinking about a shopping list and not his voter registration, right? And then, so we have that, and then of course, worst case scenario, we have the provisional ballot. And in New Mexico, if you vote a provisional ballot and we go back and can't find you on the rolls, and we have to reject you, then you can come appeal that decision. So we do have safeguards in place to address the type of, you know, situation that you described, although on a more maybe subtle, more, you know, the reality is you are never going, we're human beings. We are never going to have a perfect system. Nothing's going to be perfectly secure. But we can use best practices, and we can strive for systems that are reasonably secure, but that also allow us to do the work that we need to do to help voters cast a ballot.
So I'll note that we're coming to a close of this. If you can answer quickly, and I don't know if we have time for one more after this. No, we don't have time for one more. I'll note that the multiple redundant systems is something, a best practice that is used in many jurisdictions, so that could be both caught and corrected.
So Maggie's absolutely right. We are never going to have perfect security in our systems, on paper or online. And the best thing we can do is use best practices to avert to form backups against these problems. Maggie talked mostly about technical backups and provisional ballots. I'd also like to talk very quickly about other process redundancy. You know, if you move everyone in a state, if you go into ERIC and claim that everyone in a state has moved to Seattle, that's only a problem if everyone that you've just moved isn't in a state with same-day registration. If you have same-day registration,
It's true too.
it'll slow things down on election day, but everyone will still be able to go where they're supposed to go and vote where they're supposed to vote. So I do think there are a lot of there's a lot of process redundancy that you can think about to minimize the risks that are generated when we open our systems up in this way.
So I'm going to jump in here and correct a misconception. ERIC will never move all of the voters in a single state to Seattle. ERIC is not a voter registration list.
Right.
ERIC is a data tool that's going to inform states when their voters appear to have moved, died, or new eligible voters have moved in. ERIC will never change a voter's record. ERIC will inform a state election official that this is someone you should investigate. Under NVRA and under state policy, states will then act on that data. So all states under federal and state policy have voter registration list maintenance duties. Often what they're doing is mailing or contacting every voter in their jurisdiction, a shotgun approach to get them all. It's costly, it's timely, and it's inefficient. ERIC is going to narrow that window down to give you more bang for your buck. Here is a sliver of people that we identified and are pretty sure have changed their registration status. These are the people you should reach out to and confirm whether or not they should still accurately be registered in your jurisdiction, or perhaps their registration should be canceled because they're no longer eligible. So ERIC won't be changing anyone's voter registration status. It'll be the states under existing law.
And another, I think, really informative panel. Let's thank our panelists.